Yeah, so we're gonna finish up talking about ethical shortcuts, and then you're gonna have a group activity concerning the going farther reading at the end of the of chapter 2, the assigned chapter for today. And yeah, that'll be about it. I'll have some things that I want to talk about at the end of class, in particular concerning the module 2 worksheet, which is going to be due on Monday, but we'll get to that at the end of class. So anybody who's like sitting with maybe some questions about that, we can get there at the end of class. All right. So let's get started. So actually, last time we talked about offhanded self-justifications, and we talked about dogmatism, and we talked about how those two modes for reasoning, when we're addressing a specific ethical question, can short circuit our ethical reasoning process. So when we're looking at, is it morally permissible to lie, for example, right? Under these circumstances, is it morally permissible for somebody to do something deceptive in some kind of way? There's various ways that offhanded self-justification can undermine our critical reasoning or our ethical reasoning process there. It can essentially cause us to be super subject to our own biases and just really stay narrowly focused on the things that just kind of feel right to us. We can sort of just say, like, well, it's my opinion, something like this. And then we don't have to really dig in, go any further. It cuts off the ethical reasoning process. And we just sort of dig into our own justifications for thinking the things that we do. And then the second ethical shortcut that we talked about, or short circuit that we talked about, was dogmatism, and how we can, really lean into these maybe some principles or rules that we hold, and in leaning into those rules, these like principles that we think are correct, really shut off any further opportunity to dig in further to some bigger ethical questions, or understanding why other people disagree with us and that sort of thing. So the next ethical short circuit that we're going to talk about takes on a slightly different form. There are two ways that people can sort of dismiss big ethical questions. For instance, an ethical question about, whether or not the death penalty is something that is an okay ethical practice in a society. One way that we often see an ethical disengager pop up can be by, and I'll talk about following the law shortly, but yeah, it can be one way that we do this is somebody can say, well, it comes down to the law. If the law says it, follow the law, great. If the law doesn't, if there's no law about it, then, this is like to each their own, essentially. So from there, if somebody says something like that, it's just like, just turn to the law books, or turn to legislation to guide all of our actions, and assume that, provided we're following the law, then we're not really doing anything wrong. There's no reason to further disengage. Like, if a state says that the death penalty is legal, that's something that the state does, then there's no further question for somebody who's saying, well, we just follow the law. That's what the law says. Therefore, it's totally fine. Like, shuts off. It's sort of, it's like the first step in the ethical reasoning process. It short circuits right before we can even take that step. It just shuts down the conversation, the debate, and saying like, well, if the law says it, then it's okay. The other way that people can disengage is by sort of trying to skirt or avoid even any consideration of values. So this is something that I think we often see when people try to just cite like, well, it's just human nature, right? Like that's something that we actually kind of saw in the discussion about ethical egoism, right? Can somebody remind me what we were talking about last time with ethical egoism? Let's see, I'll pull up the slide in case you need a reminder. So yeah, the problem ethical egoism. So can somebody remind me sort of what happens when people appeal to ethical or to psychological egoism to justify their actions? Let's see. Yeah, somebody who was here last time, I think. What about Angelina? Can you do you remember what the problem is, or rather how somebody would appeal to psychological egoism to justify their actions, the morality of their actions? Angelina?
I read the book, but I forgot right now.
So this was just what we were talking about last time. Let's see. What about Sonia? Do you remember last time when we were talking about psychological egoism, how somebody would appeal to this idea that we're like, it's in our human nature to be selfish.
No, I don't remember. Sorry.
Let's see. I think there was let's see, there was Denise. I think, yeah, you raised your hand first.
Our only motivations are selfish or self-serving motivations.
And that's like inherent to human nature. Yeah. Yeah, that's on the right track. Tinika, did you wanna
Yeah, basically I was gonna say the same as Denise. Basically, our motives are selfish and we only think that we're right on that side of form.
Yeah, and it's within our human nature. So like, since it's human nature, then like, what am I doing wrong, right?
Right.
So it's a similar kind of reasoning that people will appeal to in arguing for what we might call value-free decision making, where they say, listen, there's something about the nature of this thing that we do that's just, it makes it value-free from any of our ethical concerns. So again, before we even get the conversation going, they say, no, your ethical questions here, like, that's not what we do. And the place where we probably see this the most concerns like it's really like when we're like criticizing the market, like the marketplace, like stock markets in business, right? So people say, like, this is this practice we have, it's like a dog eat dog world out there, or, it's just no matter what we do, it's just the nature of business, the nature of our economic system for companies to try to maximize their profit. Okay. And that's just the way it goes. Like, your ethical concerns aren't really relevant here, because what we're doing, our practices here are really free from anything like that. So it's similar. It's kind of like saying, instead of saying, well, humans are inherently selfish, therefore, there's nothing we can do. I'm just going to be a selfish person. End of story. You can say that, businesses, corporations, things like that in an economy, like the way that business practices work, those individual businesses are inherently selfish. And so your ethical concerns aren't really relevant here. They're not relevant to, the kinds of questions that we're asking. And one of the main problems with that kind of ethical disengager is that that in and of itself is sort of it's relying on some ethical, it's going to inevitably end up relying on some ethical principles, namely ones that come with, say, the kinds of agreements that get made, the kinds of expectations that are set within a marketplace, right? Like those in and of themselves, in a lot of ways, function as ethical principles where, okay, so what justifies, it's the nature of the market to be this way when people come together and they do this thing and they have these expectations about everybody trying to maximize their profit, right? That in and of itself is something that we can understand as an ethical principle, because the idea there being like, when we come together and we do this practice, here are these standards, some expectations set for what counts as morally, or rather for what counts as permissible behavior. And what they leave out there is that it's something they consider morally permissible, right? Is anybody familiar with this kind of argument? Has anybody ever run across this argument before? You can either speak up or add in the chat, say something in the chat box. No one's ever heard this argument before about business? Like that's just the way it goes. Yeah. John, did you want to?
Yeah.
Oh, Tinika, did you have like a specific example where you've heard this?
Let me think.
Yeah, you can take some time. Let's see. Yeah, I think John, did you want to elaborate on an example? You're the first one to say yes. So,
well, they say it's a competitive market, so you can't really think of others. You just gotta think of yourself.
Yeah. And it really immediately cuts off any kind of discussion. Like, well, you just gotta go
with the flow.
Yeah, I guess it's going with the flow. It's sort of like you're assuming that there are just these set standards and expectations about people's behaviors. And so you're conforming with that. And in a lot of ways, those are ethical principles. So what sort of underpins that is like, well, we do the thing that everybody else agrees that we should be doing, right? But it's so hard to avoid any kind of really like moral language there. Like, well, we should be doing this because that's the thing that everyone else is doing, right? When we use that word should, what we might call that a prescriptive claim. That is like a doctor prescribes medicine. We're prescribing a certain kind of mode of behavior. So on the face of it, it looks like we have a reason to sort of dismiss or disengage from an ethical debate, when in reality, that kind of reasoning still is going on in the thing that somebody's trying to use to disengage from. There's still principles there. We should be doing, this is how we should be behaving because other people are behaving in this way. We got to watch out for ourselves, that sort of thing. This is just the nature of it. This is the nature, like John was saying, this is the nature of competition. Right? And it's all fine and good if you want to, describe business practices in that way. The point here is just, you can't use that to disengage from a conversation about ethics, right? You can't use it to sort of back out from a debate about, like whether or not what this corporation did was an ethical thing to do. Yeah. So like I mentioned, this first one here, just following the law, right? This idea being like, we can just rely on the law. So if the law says it's right, then it's right. If you're not breaking the law, then whatever. At the end of the day, that's like the real place where we draw a hard line. Okay. So I don't know, actually in the chat box, how many people, sorry, there's just no way that I can avoid swearing in this example. How many people are familiar with this subreddit, Am I the Asshole? Yes or no in the chat box. I would like to hear from everyone. Have you heard of Am I the Asshole? 2, 3, 4, 5. I think there's a few more people. No. 10. Okay. I believe that was almost everyone. Okay. So, what it looks like about half of you are familiar with it. So what it is, it's essentially a place where people can go on Reddit and then they can post stories about something that they did that other people took issue with, like maybe like family, friend, boyfriend, girlfriend, whatever. And they can be like, okay, so this is what happened. This is how I reacted. Everybody is saying, like my girlfriend like thought I was being a jerk here. Like, what does everybody on Reddit think? And then everybody can like in the comments respond. And then, yeah, like essentially like, for those of you who aren't familiar with the system, you can like vote for the responses that you like and things like this. And a lot of times you'll get like thousands of people like voting like, yes, this person like was being the asshole, or no, this person wasn't being the asshole, not the asshole. Okay. So, yeah, if you want to like quickly read this, I'm going to give a synopsis of the situation here. So, we have, this guy, he's about 40 years old. He has a really nice house. I guess he has like a big group of friends. Everybody likes to hang out there. Like he has like a pool and a bar in his basement and like all this stuff. And like they throw like, he'll like host people, have them come over to watch football games and stuff like this. Like I think everybody can kind of get the picture. I'm personally imagining like one of those houses in New Jersey, like from the 80s that you see in movies, but that's just my frame of reference. Anyway, so this guy has a friend who's diabetic, and he has the friend has a diabetic alert dog. So the dog essentially is trained to keep track of those various ways. It's kind of incredible that dogs are capable of being able to monitor when someone's blood sugar, somebody who's diabetic, whether like their blood sugar is spiking or dropping. So like the dog can like if the person's about to maybe like faint because their blood sugar spiked, for instance, the dog will have things that it can do to actually help that person in that moment. Because by the time somebody gets to that place, like their brain's not working totally well, or is not working as it normally does. So, like, like maybe like giving themselves an insulin shot, is something that they won't, have it together to do. So this person, this writer is saying that, he doesn't want to have his friend's dog come. He doesn't want to have his friend's service dog come, because he doesn't want to deal with the dog poop and it peeing in the backyard. And I guess the dog sheds. He doesn't want to have the dog around there. And so he told his friend that the dog, like his friend was welcome to come, but his friend's dog wasn't welcome, to come. And instead, what this person writing the writer says is that he offered to pay for a monitoring device that his friend can use instead of having his dog with him. And he asked all of Reddit whether or not he was the asshole or the jerk, if you don't like that language, for telling his friend he couldn't bring his service dog to his house. Okay, so Reddit, I like blocked it out because I didn't want to say, but this, you can see this had 8,000, this had like 8,000 votes on it. And it looks as though people are pretty much overwhelmingly across the board saying like, yes, you are the asshole. But there were a fair number of people, if you like scroll through the long like comment threads, that were saying like, no, he's not the asshole. That's what NTA stands for. Because he has a legal right to refuse to have a dog on his property. And I thought that this was just the other day, and I was like, oh, this is perfect for what we're going to be talking about on Saturday. Because this person who got close to 1,000 upvotes, by the way, points out that this isn't, am I legally entitled to not let my friend's dog come over to my house? It's, am I an asshole? It's an ethical question that they're looking at. Because yeah, of course you have the legal right to refuse, but that doesn't tell us anything about whether or not that choice is it like ethically okay, is morally permissible. So here I thought it was really great, like people were trying to use this ethical disengager and saying like, well, this is not even a question because, if the law says it's fine, therefore it's totally fine. And when we dig deeper and we really think about what the question is here, whether or not this is an ethical thing, what we see is this very clear distinction between something being legal and something being morally permissible. There are plenty of things that our laws don't regulate, like how we treat our friends, right? We don't want laws about that because we're supposed to exercise some freedom and choice there, right? So that's why, so the second ethical disengager about, somebody saying, well, just follow the law. It doesn't get us very far. It short circuits the conversation. People think they've answered the question when in reality, they haven't even taken the first step in really engaging with the ethical question. Okay. Yeah. And then Zaquana, so in the chat box, Zaquana brought up a great point about like, well, he offered him other accommodations, but notice that is a much different argument. That is, you're not disengaging there. You're saying like, well, like he didn't want to do this thing in this way. He gave him another alternative without any kind of appeal to the law or anything like that. You're actually like looking at the question. Lisa, did you have a question? You had your hand up.
Yeah, no, I just agree with the comment that you just read, because I don't feel that he was a jerk. He, those glucose monitors are very expensive, and he offered to help him with that. So I feel that he was in his own right to help and to say what he said.
Yeah. So you agree with what Zaquana said, right? In the chat box. Yeah. But what is up on the screen right now, this thing that the screen grab I did of this one comment, that person might agree with you. The only thing, no, I guess the last sentence, like this person wouldn't agree with you. But the main point that I'm focusing on here is not answering the question of whether or not what this guy did was okay. I'm saying that appealing to the law isn't going to tell us anything, right? Like what you're talking about, Lisa, and then Zaquana in the chat box, like that is a conversation. Like there's no short circuiting that's happening there. There's like good ethical reasoning, but yeah, it's just that trying to appeal to the law. Because when you say right, like Lisa, like you were saying, like he offered to actually do this like very nice big thing, and it's his right to say no, right? Like you're not saying it's his right, his legal right, correct? Like you're saying it's his right as his home and all of these sorts of things. It's a much different sense of right. Yeah, no, that's good. Yeah, that's good. That's good. Yeah, ethics versus law. That's right. Okay, so those are the first two things that we're going to talk about with respect to these ethical short circuits. It's like the electricity doesn't even start flowing when we say things like this. It cuts the conversation off before it even starts. Okay. So the next and last ethical short circuit that we're going to talk about today is one that that I am certain all of you are familiar with, because a lot of it came up when we were talking about me now. So if you recall, one of Mino's answers to this question, what is virtue, was like, we have to look at the particular circumstances someone's in, like what is their position, say, in a home. And there was some, there were some problematic, the way that Mino and Socrates were categorizing different occupations was most certainly problematic. But like we talked about, you can easily translate that to like, okay, what are someone's moral obligations in terms of being a parent or a caretaker? What are some moral obligations that are associated with, say, being a teacher, something like this? And something that a lot of you talked about in your quizzes for that day were things that a lot of you really sympathized with that idea. And then some of you spoke about how, there's just like different moral principles in different places you go. I think this even came up in class. Like there are cultural differences in terms of like what is considered like morally okay behavior versus what's considered morally not okay behavior. So relativism is a very extreme version of those kinds of sympathies. So one of the things that I want to say right off the bat is that general consideration of these kinds of differences that we see is a great thing to investigate, especially when we may be in a situation where we're issuing judgment on people that are positioned differently than ours. So say like the United States criticizing another country for how that country is, say, treating its citizens, right? Those kinds of differences are ones that's really important to recognize and keep in mind. The issues that we're going to talk about connected with relativism short-circuiting our ethical reasoning process are not ones that concern just attending to keeping in mind the differences, maybe examining them a little bit more closely. The issues with relativism that we're going to be thinking about now are ones that are connected with just using that point, the existence of differences in moral opinions, to say, well, we don't know. Everybody's right. So this idea that moral values differ in fundamental ways between certain people and, say, certain cultures and places and things like this, it looks really good. And it's also an important thing to bear in mind when we're looking at different kinds of different disagreements. But sort of one of the benefits is coupled with one of the biggest issues with it. So yes, this is great. We encounter some kind of disagreement about some difference in moral values. And it makes space for people to maintain their beliefs, to hold their beliefs, and have disagreement with one another. Because the idea is everyone's right. Since there's a difference, that entails that there's no one answer. Okay. Can somebody give me an example of a time where you've heard somebody make that kind of argument? Well, it's like, everybody's different. So we don't have to just like to each their own kind of argument. Can somebody give me an example that they've heard? I am certain there's somebody out here in this classroom who's heard somebody make this kind of argument. Lisa, yeah.
I've heard it in jobs, like from managerial perspective, because number one, employees can't relate to what an executive has to do and the way that they think and how to run the team. So when they issue a decree or issue a rule, they're just like, oh, well, this manager would have done it like this, or that manager would have done it like that. And it's like, well, everyone's different. Like this manager has to do it this way because they're leading this particular team and we can't really compare.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I actually think I would like you to hold on to that example, because I think that there are ways that you could it's not just that, well, there's different managers, so there's no right answer. It's that there's different circumstances call for different kinds of managerial decisions and behaviors. Like, I think that's actually a really rich, great example for, you know, when we're digging in, when we continue in the ethical reasoning process, nothing short circuits, but we still bear in mind the some important lessons and takeaways that we can get from relativism, right? Yeah. So hold on. I would like us to come back to that a little bit later. Now, the kind of thing that I had in mind is actually something that Jose brought up in the chat box. So he was like, I guess that he tells people that apple juice is better than orange juice. And if and when they disagree, he just says to each their own. And I think that we do this sort of thing with music a lot, right? Like, it's like, I mean, not always. I'm sure that I'm sure that everyone here has had some kind of like dispute with people like, what, you don't like this kind of thing. But a lot of times the way that we resolve those disputes is we're like, okay, you know what? You really like your person. I really like my person. You know, I don't really like, we disagree and what we think counts as like good music. And, you know, there's a sense in which everybody is right here, right? That's where I see this sort of thing. But when we take that kind of approach, rather, in looking at fundamental disagreements between, you know, different, what we might call like value systems, we have very little recourse to critique behavior on the other side, like the behavior of the people in the group that like we disagree with, right? Because if you tell someone that they did something wrong under those circumstances, or trying to say they did anything wrong under those circumstances, it's assumed that it's a legitimate response to just say, well, I just have different values than you do. So full stop, end of story. Like the orange juice versus apple juice, right? Like, I think that's a really great thing to reference, right? Because fine, that person is you know, going to keep on buying orange juice, and you're going to keep on buying, Jose is going to keep on buying apple juice, and like whatever, right? Like there's no maybe there's no real issue there. But when it comes to certain behaviors where we think that you know, those behaviors are like morally wrong, right? We want to have a conversation. Sometimes there are times where we really need to have a conversation, get down to some, you know, like fact of the matter about it. Because we might feel, you know, under no circumstances is any kind of apartheid. The one that we've seen in most recent history is in South Africa, but like under no circumstances is a government implementing an apartheid, you know, like segregating one group of people from another based on skin color and denying Black people, like really what a lot of us would argue are basic human rights, denying them those basic human rights on the grounds of skin color. Like we would say across the board, it doesn't matter, you know, like whatever the cultural sort of justification you're trying to use for doing something like that. It's wrong. That's, you know, your fundamental principles at play here that gave rise to this system are wrong. And it's not, okay, well, you can go do that in like the South African government prior to the end of the apartheid, like that government, like you go do your thing, like you go buy your orange juice. Like it's fine. We'll just have our apple juice over here, right? Like we want to have some kind of influence. We want to be able to say that what they're doing is objectively wrong, right? So has anybody had any kind of experience where they've found themselves in this kind of disagreement where somebody's been saying they have you disagree with one of their, like something that they're saying, and then they say, or something that they're doing, and they're like, well, to each their own. So you don't have anything to say here. Like, has anyone ever experienced that? Okay, so hopefully you'll have some more examples. Anybody who anything comes to mind, like feel free to jump in. So one example of this happening is an example we saw in the book where we have person A saying, I support the death penalty because I believe it saves lives and it deters people from killing. And then the other person in conversation says, B says, I don't agree. And then A says, why? And then B says, I just don't. That's my opinion and it's as good as yours, right? So this is a classic example of the thing that I was just asking before, like, have you experienced something like this? Where there's something that we have a person who's saying, like, A is saying they've like thought about why they think, it's morally permissible to have the death penalty. They've given a couple of reasons for it, right? Like they're going through the process, like they're doing the ethical reasoning thing. And then B short circuits, doesn't engage. I just don't think that a death penalty is okay. And that is just my opinion and it's as good as yours. So here, what we find is somebody really leaning into this idea that moral values differ in fundamental ways. And because of this difference, everyone's right. So fine, everyone's right. I'm right, you're right. We're both right about the death penalty. Even though we have these two fundamentally opposing views, we're both right. There's no recourse here. There's no further conversation. Ethical reasoning, short circuits, right? In part because it's not just the relativism bit that this person is leaning into. They use it in order to justify their disagreement with A. So this is where, and this is going to be a question on the worksheet, just to let you know, for those of you who haven't seen it, this is where we see relativism slip into offhanded self-justification, where we have somebody just appealing to their own networks of their belief, and they sort of use relativism, this point about this, there being the existence of these differences, in order to justify their own opinion. So they sort of use relativism, the idea that everybody has, we have a bunch of differences about moral values. And because of those differences, no one's right. They use that idea as a tool to say, well, my opinion is just as good as yours, and I don't have to give you any reason why. I just don't agree with it, right? No further evidence other than your personal beliefs. So I'm just going to say it one more time, just because I want to make sure it's crystal clear. So the idea of offhanded self-justification, which is just like appealing to your own beliefs and being like, those are my beliefs. That's what makes it right. That short circuiting, using relativism, the idea that differences mean that no one's right, as a tool to say, well, it's just my opinion. That's enough evidence because everybody's opinion is right. Okay. So this is how ultimately in this process of offhanded self-justification, the appeal to relativism sort of goes, facilitates an ethical short circuit. Okay. Does anybody have any questions about that? No. All right, great. Wonderful. Okay, so I think I've kind of danced around some reasons why relativism isn't a good route to take. Now we're going to start digging into some reasons why, specific reasons why, this really extreme everybody is right, or sorry, everybody is different, therefore everybody is right sort of take or approach to ethics is a problem. So here we identified this as like a short circuit. We know that it can short circuit it can lead to this short circuit that's like offhand that we see in offhanded self-justification. But resisting it, like the antidote for it, really is a place where philosophy actually can help us in a lot of ways, because there's not going to be that temptation to slip into it if we identify essentially some good reasons for thinking that that level of relativism isn't right. If we give some reasons, some objections, what we would call in philosophy, some objections to the big claim that relativism is making. So one of the first major objections is that we can't, saying like, well, I have one opinion about the death penalty and you have another opinion about the death penalty, or even saying something, to go back to the example from Am I the Asshole, right? And being like, well, you think it's okay for this person to not let their friend's dog come over to their house, and I don't, and everybody's right here, right? So like, yeah. I think the death penalty is not okay. You think it is. We disagree. People disagree. Therefore, there's no right answer. You think it's okay to have the dog over, or you think it's wrong to like not allow the dog to come over. I think that it's totally fine that he did that. People disagree. There's no right answer about it, right? In both of those cases, we're thinking like we're setting rules, and sort of what's operating in the background is this idea that everybody can just do what they please, right? Like, all right, so some people are going to think that it's okay to prohibit the dog from coming over. Other people are going to say it's not, like, whatever. Or in a more extreme case, like there's going to be death penalty, and some people aren't going to like it, and some people are going to think it's okay. End of story, right? But the reality is that we live in a society with each other, right? Like we have thoughts and opinions about like what people should and shouldn't do. We have thoughts and opinions about the kinds of legislation that our governments should pass that do things like make the death penalty legal, or get rid of the death penalty altogether. So, and I mean, the reason why we vote on laws like that, or people vote on laws about that, is because that rule specifically, like the death penalty, is one that is going to affect other people. It's not as if you can have your opinion about the death penalty and somebody else can have theirs and nobody's affected, right? Like there's going to be people that are sentenced to death, and you're going to have opinions about it. And those opinions might inform voting choices that you make. They might inform other decisions that you make about, getting involved, being more like politically active, like some kind of organizing efforts to maybe like fight for legislation that makes the death penalty illegal or something like this. Like because we're in a society, there's going to be other people that are going to be affected by the different rules that we set. Those might not be laws, right? Like we might have, like Lisa and Zaquano were talking about, like there might be other, really important moral concerns that everybody should be bearing in mind. Like, people have a right to decide whether or not they want a dog in their house. There were a lot of people on Reddit that disagreed with what this person was doing. We don't want to put that stuff into law, but there's some thinking there. There's some principles, some moral principles that are at play. What principles we ultimately think we should be bearing in mind are ones that are going to affect other people. So there are 4 more objections to relativism that come specifically from philosophers. So these are like in Western philosophy, when you're like teaching an ethics class, which would involve like more of the theoretical stuff than what we're doing here. But there, you would like, there's the papers, people that have like spent time like writing arguments against others who have advocated for taking this relativistic approach to morality, essentially saying like, well, there's differences, so there's no right answer. So one of the first issues that gets raised in the face of relativism, especially relativism that is like, well, there's this cultural difference, right? Does anybody have like an example right off the bat of like a cultural difference, like something that you know is okay in one place, but in another place is not considered morally permissible? I'm sure that there's somebody here that has some example like that. Lisa, yeah.
I know in some cultures that it's permissible to marry multiple wives, and in other cultures it's not.
Yeah. Polygamy. There's a state in the United States that really, it was annexed almost for the sole purpose of, although that's not necessarily a reflection of like Mormons today, or what the Mormon church says, it's not a reflection of their values today, but they established like their own state boundaries in order to make that something that it was a principle that was so important that there was a state established in order to make it legal, because in other states in the United States at that point, polygamy was not legal. These are so good. Let's see. Catherine brings up living together before marriage, right? Yeah. And I think that there's so much variation in that. Like, I know in the United States, like certain people like, oh, they have, I think sometimes like it gets described as like traditional values, or being of a certain era. It might not even be a cultural difference. It might be like an older generation really doesn't like it when a younger people in younger generations who are romantically involved move in together. Jose brings up an excellent one. Our society, or rather a lot of people in the United States, consume pork and see no issue with doing that, whereas that is not at all okay if you're Muslim. So I think that, that example, Jose, is exactly the kind of thing that gets that people that argue for relativists want to appeal to be like, okay, well, like we're not going to want to make rules about whether or not it's okay to eat pork just based off of religion. There's a difference, but we just need to make space for everybody to be right here. I think that, at least to me, seems like a pretty reasonable take on this question of like, is it objectively okay to eat pork, right? So we can make space for that kind of difference. But there's a really serious question for other kinds of cultural differences that are often pointed to, that relativists point to say like that they claim are like the pork example. So, but the moral questions involved there are a lot bigger. So a really common one, this was discussed in the textbook, is this claim about Inuit cultures, or Inuit groups that I don't even recall like what the timeline is, but in the past, prior to colonization of the Americas, they had this practice of sending like their elderly, like once they're elderly, like we're not physically able to really actively participate in society anymore, like sending them off into the wilderness to essentially like die of hypothermia and starve. So has anyone, yes or no in the chat box, have you heard of this? Have you heard this claim before? Like there's like some Native American, I think a lot of times it goes like Native American cultures, like just sent the elderly out. You've never, yeah. So that claim is false. We're going to talk about it in a little bit, but I just want to know if people have been familiar with this claim before. Wow. Okay. So yeah, we just got we only have like a few people, it seems, that are familiar with this. Yeah, I wonder if maybe those of us who are familiar with it are just a little bit older, because I feel like it's something that I heard a lot a long time ago. Not to like, I'm wondering if it might be like a little bit of a generational thing. In any case, that is false. What happened? So, because I mean, the idea that there'd be a culture that says we should just this is something that's morally permissible to do, like, right, like leave people who like are in need of care and assistance out literally in the cold to starve to death, right? Like that probably sits wrong with most people in this room. And there's like various ways that mostly white people have sort of like romanticized this practice, like being like it was like considered a noble way to die, all of these sorts of things. Like, and a lot of those people make these claims about like these relativistic claims, like, well, it was just different in that society and we have different values now. And when we stop and we go and try to actually look for as evidence that this is something that like Inuit groups, any Inuit groups, because there were a lot of different ones, did, there is no evidence. It's one of those things that you hear a lot, and then the second you actually go to fact check it, like you hear it so much, you wouldn't even think to fact check it because you've heard so many people saying it, right? But the second you go to fact check it, there's no evidence. In fact, the little bit of evidence that we have, mainly through like these like there's like these like verbal histories that are getting recorded now a lot more. But when we like the little evidence we have of like specific moral values that were held by Inuit in like different Inuit cultures, really, like there was reverence for elders. Like doing something like that to an elder, I mean, the implication being that like that would have been, from everything we know, it actually would have been a horrible thing to do. And a lot of times when these kinds of like extreme points get made, like claims about cannibalism, like certain groups cannibalizing, or practicing cannibalism, like when we go and we actually look for the evidence in these instances that people say like, well, look at this, you know, we would think that's totally morally wrong, but you know, our like, it was just a different culture. It was a different time. It was whatever. As soon as we go and we try to look for evidence in these like really, I mean, really wild out there stories, like, you know, people sending like their elderly out into the cold to starve to death, or people eating other people. What we end up finding is like, there's actually like this difference is like, it's fiction. So the first thing we want to do when somebody's like making this argument about relativism is we want to fact check, especially when they're making empirical claims. We want to make sure that whatever they're saying, this like wild thing that this other group, this other culture does, right? We want to make sure that that is actually going on. Now, we might find that there is a big difference in practices. Like we have plenty of empirical evidence of the apartheid in South Africa, for instance. So if we have something like that, what we want to do is really think hard about whether those differences in and of themselves should be the last word, because that ultimately is what relativism is arguing for, right? It's saying, well, there's differences, so everybody's right. But that requires further argument. That requires explanation as to why different values, different and conflicting values, are fundamentally evidence of the fact that no one's right about the situation. I think a lot of times when people appeal to that kind of like that level, that extreme kind of relativism to say like, well, I guess we don't know, it's because it's a hard thing to answer, right? Like it's hard to say, like, if somebody, for instance, in a place where people practice polygamy, and it's like and there's people that live in that in a place where that's done, and it's like an important part of their life, and it's like a fundamental part of like how their like community and society is structured, it feels difficult to really issue any kind of moral judgment there about whether the practice of polygamy in and of itself is something that's morally permissible, because there may be things associated with those practices, like specific practices, that we find problematic. Oftentimes the way that women are treated in societies that have polygamous practices. For example, the way that women were treated in Utah prior to Utah making polygamy illegal were deeply problematic. They were deeply troubling. Not only, and this isn't to say that this goes across the board, right? But like when we look at a specific situation where we saw that practice going on, while maybe we don't have anything to say about polygamy, we do have some judgments about, just fundamental rights that shouldn't be overlooked simply because polygamy is the practice. For example, in Utah, there was a lot of it was men that were married to multiple women. And oftentimes they were married to, sometimes I think like women as young as 12 and 14, right? Or girls or children. They were married to children as young as 12 and 14. And we can make judgments about that, right? Like we can make this shouldn't be a matter of, okay, well, to each their own, this is just what they do in their version of polygamy. We could say like, okay, maybe if polygamy is something that I don't want to issue a moral judgment about, but polygamy under these circumstances where children are being married off, I don't think that's morally permissible. Okay. So Jose, you said that this was a big issue in Latin America as well. Is there a specific place in Latin America that you know about that? Yeah, I mean, I do think that this is something that is like, it's a thing that crops up in so many different places, right? So like, if that's what you're taking, I think a lot of the time when people hear about polygamy, like that's the first thing they go to, like kids getting married. It's not necessarily inherent to the practice, but we can criticize practices where that thing starts to go on, where we see that sort of thing. We might want to say like, that's totally impermissible under any circumstances. So the next thing, if we identify a difference, the next thing we want to think about is whether those differences should ultimately be the last word. And oftentimes when we dig in, we find that it's not this answer of like, well, there's differences. It's not enough. It's not good enough reason for us to put off the conversation about who's right in these conflicts, right? The other thing that we want to think about is this idea that what the differences in the values really mean, right? So to the polygamy question, we can think about, is this practice of like if we were just looking at Utah and we were saying like what was happening in Utah was wrong, and we wanted to say polygamy was wrong because there were young children that were getting married off, right? In those cases, we would say one thing that we want to be really thinking about carefully there is like what the implications of the argument are. Like this issue we see this issue, this ethical issue that we're talking about that seems really right, also popping up in situations where maybe polygamy isn't being practiced. And in those cases, what we might end up finding is at the heart of the disagreement actually doesn't have anything to do with polygamy. When we really identify clearly what the questions are that concern us, what we find are principles that we do feel like we can issue some objective moral judgments about. It may look like this is something, essentially saying like it might look like there's some difference in what we initially started arguing about, but once we dig in, we found there was differences between other values that it's pretty clear there is an objectively right moral judgment to make here. Like it's morally wrong to like put children in these situations where they're like experiencing these sort of things, right? But as we found, like that's not necessarily like what the disagreement over polygamy was about. Okay. Did anybody want to add on to any part of that discussion? Like, yeah, I feel like I kind of took that example and I really went with it. And there's just so much there because it's such a complicated subject. Okay. So the last objection to relativism that philosophers make is this question of, okay, so we get into these arguments, but do the conclusions we draw make a practical difference, right? So one thing to really think about, in the apartheid example, is what the consequences of coming down and saying like, no, what the South African government is doing is wrong, right? If that is an argument that, say, another powerful entity like the United States uses to intervene, or maybe like the United Nations to intervene by putting I'm forgetting the word that they it's like the trade sanctions that they use where they like cut off trade with like a country or something like this in order to pressure the South African government to end the apartheid, right? Like those are some pretty practical applications of really engaging and thinking about what's going on there, and really like sort of trying to push past some of the difficulty and complexities in these disagreements that stem from what some people might describe as like a cultural difference or something like this. Trying to like push past that and really give a thoughtful and careful analysis, like do a good job with the critical reasoning stuff, a good job with the ethical reasoning stuff to draw certain conclusions. And the application of those conclusions can make a practical difference. In doing that, going through that process, pushing ourselves in that process, like we can produce things that can actually like end up making a pretty serious practical difference. So the idea that through not short-circuiting with the ethical, not short-circuiting with relativism and being like, well, there's differences, that's just the way it is, everybody's right, and trying to push past that and really look at the situation, thinking about things on both sides, but everything that's happening there, paying careful attention to that, and then drawing some arguments that actually could make a practical difference. Like that is an important, that's an important piece. really what ultimately is disengaging and saying, well, there's just a difference, there's no answer here, is assuming that there's nothing that we can really do to make a practical difference. And depending on the circumstances, we see sometimes that a practical difference really can get made, right? In terms of what sorts of actions are taken in light of somebody saying, you know what, I'm going to come down hard and say, like, this is wrong. We should, like, this, this government shouldn't be doing this. So believe, yeah. All right. So does anybody have any of their own examples of relativism that have been like just floating around in the back of your mind, like something, an argument that you've heard before in the past? Or maybe even an argument that you've made that like you feel a little bit differently about now? Okay, well, what about like a specific moral question that you think the answer to is one that would affect everybody? Like, what are essentially like, what are some specific, like, try to think of a specific moral question that have, oh yeah, Lisa, yeah.
One more question that comes to my mind is when it comes to pregnancy and women having to be forced to go back to work. Like I've heard women who've gone back to work 2 weeks after they've delivered a baby. And I feel that that's wrong. So just really looking at what should America do in terms of paid maternity leave for women, maybe for a year, give them enough time since we all work and pay taxes. Like 6 weeks is not enough. So I think that discussion is big.
Yeah. Like the amount, like what kind of resources people have access to. And it's not, and in a lot of places, it's not just paid maternity leave. There's paid parental leave. There's paternity leave, there's like it's everybody with the kid that gets time off of work. It's not just a matter of physically recovering. It's also a matter of having like the resources necessary for staying with a newborn, like when they are fresh, brand new in the world as well. And so the kinds of resources that we want our societies, like our governments, to make available to people, that is something that is going to affect everyone. So like if somebody has like say a mom has a basic human right to physically recover after giving birth and spending like 6 months, a year with the child, like if you think of those things as basic human rights, that question of whether that's, like what we decide about that is going to be one that affects a lot of people. Yeah. That's a great, that is an excellent, excellent example of a question that, relativism really is not giving us the right answers there. Does anybody else have another example of like an ethical question that relativism does not give us the right answers for? Because it affects, the answer is going to affect so many people. I'm sure there's at least one more person. What about Nadia? Have you thought of an example? Nadia? Nadia? Let's see who else. I'm going to try a couple more people. What about Daniel? Do you have an example?
I would say maybe abortion.
Yep. I mean, that's definitely a lot of birth related things. But I mean, it's somebody's what we it's, I think that really on like both sides of this unfortunate debate, nobody, like you're going to have people who are like advocates for abortion access are going to say like, you should never tell anybody, like saying like, oh, okay, people can choose whether or not they, it's not even necessarily a matter of choice. It's like everybody should have the option to do this if this is something that they need to do.
Right.
We don't want to like not even leaving space really for some people to say, well, I think it's wrong, right? Like the idea being that you don't tell other people what you shouldn't set laws concerning like what people end up doing with their bodies. And then obviously on the other side, there's like that isn't going to be satisfied with the relativism answer either, because they're going to say, no, we should have laws, we should have rules. There should be something that's prohibited. That's an excellent example. Let's see who else. What about Catherine? Do you have an example of a big like moral question that affects people that relativism doesn't give us a good answer for?
I was gonna say abortion, but the death penalty is another one.
Yep, death penalty. Yeah. Let's see. Oh, great. Excellent. Angelina, that is a perfect thing for us to think about before we go on a break, because that is going to be what we're talking about in the group activities today. So Angelina brought up, what about global warming? And that I think is maybe I think that's a huge one, right? Like we can't just leave it up for people to like go their own ways, right? Because it is collective action. Mainly like big corporations and things like this. And that's something that the article gets into, but it's collective action that is gonna like end up making a difference there. And that, no action gets taken. We keep leaving those who don't want to pay attention to it or have found ways to dismiss it to their own devices, doing their own thing. Then everybody is really going to get hurt. I mean, people are already getting hurt. So yeah, I think that is a excellent issue with it's like maybe one of the strongest examples you can bring up of like these instances where relativism really doesn't get us there. So yeah. On that note, so we're going to take, this is perfect. So we're going to take a 10-minute break. I'm going to go a little bit longer this time because I want people to stretch, all that sort of thing. In order to complete this group activity assignment, you will need to have read the article at the end of chapter 2. So the article titled "By the Way Your Home is on Fire" by Rebecca Solnit. And if you did read it, maybe you read it quickly, like you want to spend that time reviewing it, great. Anybody who did not do the reading at all, I would like you to just stick around with me here during the break. So so those of you who like maybe want to review it a little bit, read it, or if you read it, like go stretch, whatever. And then the people who did not read the article at all, I would like them to stay here and talk with me. Okay. Does that make sense to everyone?